Welcome to the Own Your Choices, Own Your Life podcast. I am your host, Marsha Van Weinsberg. I'm a business coach, speaker, and author of the best-selling book, When She Stopped Asking Why. On this podcast, we will use the tips, tools, and strategies used by myself and our speakers to break through and overcome the challenges in our lives. When we take radical responsibility of our choices, create boundaries, grow our courage, and practice self-care and letting go of what isn't ours to control, we can completely change our stories. When we take full ownership of our stories, we take back our personal power, and this allows us to impact, serve, and support others by showing them that they are not alone and helping them find freedom from their stories. When you own your choices, you truly own your life. Let's dive in. Welcome to another episode of Own Your Choices, Own Your Life. And this is the Friday Facts episode where I share a little fact about me, and maybe in that process, you'll take away one or two tips that might help you in your life. So this is a very quick episode on vulnerability, which is not a quick topic, but it's a different twist. So I'm going to share with you today something that vulnerability needs that it doesn't always have. So vulnerability needs boundaries. I was listening to a podcast with Brene Brown, one of my absolute favorites. You know, if you've listened to this podcast before, that I learned so much through her work, and understanding what vulnerability was really helped me to finally be in a space of opening up and talking about what my shame stories were and how I really didn't know how to use my voice. But vulnerability has brought some of the most incredible people, connections, and relationships into my life that it just deserves 1,000 episodes. It's just such a big topic. But today I want to share something that I heard her talk about on the podcast with Simon Sinek. And she talked about how vulnerability needs boundaries. It absolutely needs boundaries. So I want to explain this a little bit further to you. Vulnerability without boundaries is actually manipulative. So people need to earn the right to hear your story. You get to decide who that is, and it isn't for everyone. Without boundaries, the intentions are really unclear, and you definitely create very, very muddy waters. So it's important to know who you're talking to, why you're sharing the story, and without those things, it can be manipulative. So let me give you an example. I'm sure you've all seen this. There have been stories that people will share online, and it comes from the space or energy of look at me, or look at how bad my story is, or blaming someone else for where their story is at, or giving details that aren't necessary for the context of the story. Sometimes people will share a story and there's so much blame in the undertone that it comes across as manipulative, and it comes across as look at me. Now, let me just say in all transparency and kindness that this takes practice. So we're going to get it wrong. Whenever we practice anything, we're going to just fluff up and get it not the way that we want it to be. When I first learned how to share my story, I couldn't for the life of me figure out how to share it and be respectful to my kids, to the details, to everything that was going on. And it wasn't until I heard Lisa Nichols say this, and I've referred to this so many times in this podcast because it's so important when you're talking about vulnerability and sharing difficult stories. If you cannot share the story with the people that you are referring to in the room with you, then you have it in the wrong context. And if you can't share it without falling apart in tears, then you're not ready. And that's okay. Like there might be stories that you're never going to share, and you don't have to. Vulnerability doesn't mean you have to share everything. It's not it at all. So when I first was in a space of writing my book and sharing my story, boy, I could not figure this out. And when it came time to share my story online or in posts or from a stage, I couldn't figure out how to share enough context that I could explain what I had come through with still being respectful to everybody in the story. And this took a really long time. And now for people who know me really well and know all of the parts of my story, when they hear me speak, or they hear me share part of it, or they read about it in a book or posts, they always say, like, you're not sharing that much, actually. But people who don't know me are saying, oh my God, that's so vulnerable. So it's all in context with the details that are there. There are going to be parts of my life that will never make social media, podcast, posts, stories. They just won't. They really probably will never leave the confines of my own home and what we've come through because there's no need for it. And there's no need for it because it's not respectful to the other people who are in the story. That's where vulnerability needs boundaries. It needs to have boundaries because without it, it will come across as manipulative, even if you don't mean it to. So if I were to go in and tell you all of the stories of the things that we lived through and what happened without actually having a purpose to help you or to support you or of any kind like that, it is manipulative. So that is really important. And I realize that that's going to be a hard one to understand. I will continue to cover more and more on vulnerability because it's a really important topic. But vulnerability is having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. It's not weakness, it's our greatest measure of courage. That is from Brene Brown. Vulnerability leads to some of the most incredible relationships. This is the second quote I'm going to use from her because it's so good. In our culture, we associate vulnerability with emotions that we want to avoid, such as fear, shame, and uncertainty. Yet we too often lose sight of the fact that vulnerability is the birthplace of joy, belonging, creativity, authenticity, and love. Every single relationship that I have in my life now that is new from over the last few years, or any relationship that I had before then that I still have now, was all enhanced by vulnerability because I found a way to share my voice, my message, my story from my perspective, not from anyone else's perspective. And it helped me to build connections and collaborations, relationships, fulfillment with other people because I allowed myself to be seen. I didn't put that spotlight on my kids or the story. It's about me. That's what vulnerability is. It is 100% about us. So if you are in a space of sharing your story and trying to find a way to do it, ask yourself, do you have boundaries in place? Do you have parts of your story that no one is ever going to know and they don't need to? Do you have parts of your story that you are not sharing because it's not respectful and because it's not from your perspective? So I can't tell you how to do this. It's a practice, but I am saying that boundaries are incredibly important. And I've implemented so many boundaries in my own personal life over the last few years. This is something I've done without really thinking about it, but I wanted to put some context to it to share it with you. Vulnerability does need boundaries. It really, really does, because everybody that you share your story with, they have to have earned the right to hear that story. Some of my closest friends know a lot of parts of my story because they literally earned the right to hear it and they were here, but they will never make mainstream story because it's not necessary. It's just not necessary. So make vulnerability about you, your experiences, your emotions, what you went through, not about anyone else who's in the story, and give it some context so that there are boundaries in place because you don't need to share the whole thing. It's just not necessary. So I hope that message lands and I hope that it has some value for you because there's a lot of magic that can happen when we learn how to be more vulnerable and we learn how to share, show up, share who we are, all of those things. It will open up so many doors of connection and relationships that you can't even see right now. I always say that you never know where your story is going to go, but it's going to take you to places and people that you didn't even know before, and you will impact someone else's life that you don't know, and they will impact yours because they can now see you. It's an incredibly powerful experience to go through to learn how to be vulnerable. And I can't speak enough about it. So if this message lands, let me know, tag me, share it. I always appreciate and reshare because I love and appreciate you for helping me to continue to spread this message even further. And as we continue to go down this road, if this is something that you want to learn more on, this is what I do in my 12 weeks to owning your story. It is a 12-week container, but you have lifetime access. The whole program is changing. It's 12 weeks of content, but you have access to the container, to the weekly calls, to the support from the grads who've come through it. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful space because the more people that step into learning how to share their story and use their solutions, their lessons, their solutions for other people, honestly, the bigger the ripple effect. And that's what I'm all a part of. So have an incredible day. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Own Your Choices, Own Your Life podcast. If you loved this episode, please submit a rating and review on iTunes, and please share it with someone you think could benefit from hearing this message or this podcast. I love connecting and meeting you, so please screenshot the episode and tag me on social media or Instagram stories at Marsha Van W. And until next time, remember, when you own your choices, you truly own your life.